There is in Florence a painting by Alessandro Botticelli that was commissioned by Lorenzo de' Medici in the late 15th century. It's called The Birth of Venus. It's a very famous painting, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. And it depicts Venus kind of riding to the shore, standing on a scallop shell. She's a fully mature woman, and there's a sort of handmaiden on one side ready to throw clothes over her, and the winds are blowing in her hair just to make it sort of very kind of Renaissance stuff. There's one thing that bothers me about that painting, and it's the notion that the goddess comes to us already fully formed. There is no sense that this figure of Venus has experienced any infancy, any childhood, any adolescence, and all the angst and formation of character that brings. And there is no sort of intentionality in the picture that leads us to believe that the goddess will age. This is the goddess who she is now and forevermore. And I wonder if when we come to the Gospels, and we look at Jesus, we don't have that same notion about Jesus in our heads too. That Jesus kind of comes to us sort of fully formed. We have such a strong notion within Christianity of the presence of God in this person of Jesus that we don't think of Jesus and his formation. We don't think of Jesus growing up. We don't think of his childhood. We don't think of his adolescence. And the one story that we do have about him in his near teenage years is a story where he goes to the temple in Jerusalem and confounds the teachers of Israel. Certainly a child prodigy, a child like no other. And can we possibly relate to that? And so we look at the Gospels and we see Jesus traveling through them, and he cuts right across all the anxieties and all the uncertainties of our own lives with his own single-minded purpose and focus. And I think if we see Jesus like that, when we get to the end of the Gospel reading today, it is a puzzling enigma for us for how it is resolved. Because Jesus tells the disciples when they find him that he is going to take a new path. And if we follow the stories that come after this, we see there really isn't a new path. All Jesus is doing is going from town to town doing exactly the same thing that he did in Capernaum, which is preaching about the kingdom of God and healing and bringing wholeness to the demented. What is the difference? I do not remember my first days as a person working in the church professionally. It's a long time ago. I do remember, unfortunately, my first sermon. And it was given in Wyoming, Iowa in October of 1981. And I know I've preached better since then. I'm not sure I could say I preached worse. But I also remember the reaction. There was in the congregation an old Presbyterian minister and his spouse who were caretaking for the off-season the Presbyterian camp just outside of town. And they invited us, Thelma and I, to their cabin for lunch. And it was an incredibly hospitable and gracious time. They asked us questions about us, about where we were headed in our minds, in our ministry. Not one word of advice or approach about sermon. And years later, I wondered who preached the best sermon on that day. I do remember as the weeks and months went on, as I gained a deeper sense of my calling and entered the church more deeply, there were days when I felt like I was living through times of high anxiety and confusion. There were times when I knew I was out of my depth and certainly wondered if I was out of my mind. And yet there were those days when everything seemed to click, when the sky seemed bluer, the grass greener, and the sun shining that much brighter, because it was all right. And as I come to this text, I bring those memories with me of what it was like in my early years in ministry. As we get closer to calling an associate pastor, these things begin to impact me as I read this text. And when you put this text together with the one we read last week, I think Mark is giving us a picture of what it was like in the first day of Jesus on the job as a Messiah. And there were some things that were good and right and intentional. And as I read the story and reflect on it and hold it in my heart, I also see some things in the story that are unintentional, that are accidental, that are chaotic, that are beyond control. Certainly, the lesson last week about the person who interrupted Jesus' teaching in the synagogue, Jesus' response there is intentional, very focused. Certainly for this week, after worship, going to Peter's house and encountering Peter's mother-in-law, that too is intentional when he goes in and takes her by the hand and raises her up off of her sickbed. And Mark is very, very particular about the words that he uses. The word that he uses for raise is exactly the same word that he uses for Jesus on Easter Sunday. And we are meant to see in this little tiny story a resurrection event where this woman was given new life. And Mark is signaling to us where the story of the gospel is really headed in the end. This is about resurrection. And then it gets chaotic. When the sun goes down and the Sabbath restrictions are eased and people can move around, all of a sudden the entire town, the entire village comes to the doorfront of Peter's house, mobs Jesus with all the sick and all the demented. And it is mob rule, it is chaos, it is a feeding frenzy with Jesus right at the center of it. And I begin to get a sense that Jesus is reacting out of need, not so much intentionally, but overwhelmed. I imagine by the time that the last petitioner left that evening, Jesus was exhausted, but he probably didn't get much sleep that night, turning things over in his head. And indeed, the text says, while it was still dark, he left and sought out a lonely place to pray. And again, Mark is very intentional about the language that he uses. Mark only uses the word dark a few times in the gospel, and every time it is used, it is always at a pivotal point in the story where the character in question has to make a decision on which hinges the rest of the story. And so Mark is again sort of going to the end of the gospel and bringing it forward, saying that this is a Gethsemane moment. This is a time when Jesus goes out and he wrestles with what has happened the day before to figure out what was right and what was good about what he did, and where did it all go wrong. And as he's wrestling with that, the disciples come up and find him. And I think it's in that encounter between Jesus and Peter that Jesus begins to get some clarity about where he is going and what his ministry is all about. And again, Mark is very intentional with his language. He says the disciples went out and hunted for Jesus. Now, this is not the kind of hunting that a single person does back in classical times with a bow and arrow or a spear, all out by themselves. No, this was probably better translated by the term big game hunting, where you take out a bunch of people who are beaters and spotters and shooters that surround the quarry, a wild and dangerous beast, and drive it into the killing zone so that you can either kill it and capture it and then take it back home to use it as a trophy. Wait a minute. That's not playing hide and seek. Think about that. The disciples went out to capture Jesus, to bring him back to Capernaum, so that Jesus could be chained down as their resident faith keeper. That's not the Jesus that we know in the Gospels. That's not a path that he chooses to follow. And I think it's in that moment when he looks Peter full in the face, when Peter says, everyone's been searching for you, that he sees a man who has come to call him to account, to deal with all the sick and the demented in the region, but who himself has not lifted a finger to alleviate any of the suffering. And I go back to the beginning of the text, where Jesus comes out of the synagogue with the 4 men, goes into Peter's house, and Peter's mother-in-law is lying there in the fever, sick. She cannot even get up. And think about the callousness of the situation. Yes, I understand the cultural world of Jesus. Peter is paterfamilias, head of the household, top of the heap. The mother-in-law is only there because her husband is dead and her family is either dead as well or too poor to take him back. She is the lowest, most insignificant person in the household apart from the servants. And yet, where's the humanity? Peter goes off to synagogue with his friends. Who stays in the house with this woman? He comes back with his buddies and expects her to get up out of her bed and serve them hand and foot. How callous. And yet it is Jesus who goes and extends his hand and raises her up. I think Jesus is looking all that in the face when Peter comes to drag him back to Capernaum. There is a difference in the ancient world between curing someone and healing someone. Curing involves taking the symptoms and the causes of a disease and making it like it never was, restoring a person to perfect wholeness. And I think when we read the Gospels, that's what we think of when we see Jesus healing people. We see the blind seeing, the deaf hearing, the lame jumping up and dancing as though there was never anything wrong with them at all. Healing is different. Healing may involve dealing with some of those physical circumstances, but it has a social aspect to it that simple curing does not have. Healing also means taking a person by the hand and taking them from outside of the community where they have been shunned because of their illness or because they are demented. And not only dealing with what inhibits them from functioning as a human being, but restoring them back into right relationships within the community. And if you look at the healing stories of Jesus in the Gospels, it may be entirely ambiguous how the healing happens, but always everyone who is healed is brought back into the enfolding, embracing nature of sacred community. What is Jesus about? He is about preaching the coming of the kingdom of God, the coming of the time when God's economy, when God's household rules will be the standard by which we live and not the rules of tyrants. And the healing of those who are physically sick or demented is a concrete manifestation of bringing those people up from the outside to the inside and making real what that community of God's people is going to look like. And that is the path that he chooses to follow from Capernaum on. What has that to do with us? I think we are at a very significant time in the life of the church, nationwide, maybe even culture-wide, maybe even sort of Eurocentric. And that is, how do we be and act as authentic church in our post-9/11? We may very well be moving through our own dark night of the soul, where we sort of take a catalog view of what we have that works and what is good and right. and like Jesus, wrestle with where it's going wrong, where the disconnects are, and how do we move forward. We have just about all the pieces here in place for a robust children's and youth ministry. And yet we are so frustrated that the pieces don't seem to fit together like they used to. We know that being a mission-driven church is a key marker towards vitality and vibrancy as a congregation, and we are indeed incredibly generous. But at the same time, we look at what our money has done, what our giving has done, and we sense that we have fallen short of fulfilling the hopes of what we could accomplish. Again, the pieces don't quite fit. And there is no lack of voices out there who would tell us what we need to be and who we need to be and what we need to do. I get emails every week from these kinds of folks giving me opportunities for how we can help them. But maybe we need to take a page out of this text and learn the difference between cure and healing. We are not about curing people. We are not about curing things. It is not our business to make everything better, to create a Christian utopia where there is peace and harmony and justice without effort. That's dragging us back to be chained like Jesus was going to be with the disciples in Capernaum. Our job is healing. Our job is reaching out a hand and taking a broken person by that hand and raising them up. Seeing that person as a human being with value and dignity in their own right. Yes, dealing with some of the circumstances in their life, but bringing them back into a sense of community that is embracing and in which they can function meaningfully. That's what it is to build the kingdom of God. That's what it is to lay the foundation for ministry for a church in this century. That is what